everyone is waiting to see what more could come. These are well-fortified institutions. Those other concerns we've been talking about at CBS for days, sleeper cells, low-level terror attacks, those things are harder to gauge against. And we do know that on the homeland front here in America, officials have been talking about planning for that as well.
Margaret, you used the word calibrated. The president during the campaign made some references to that retaliatory act that Iran took in response to the killing of Qasem Soleimani. And he suggested in his remarks that the Iranian response was kind of calibrated. In other words, almost with a theatrical quality. Something had to be done to satisfy domestic pressure, but that it was not on a scale of 1 to 10, say a 10 response. Is that the way in which you mean calibrated in terms of this early action that we're learning about just now?
Precisely. In that 2020 attack, we know from the then head of CENTCOM, General McKenzie, who's written about it, talked about it on our air because he was preparing the theater at the time. They saw the Iranian missiles get ready to launch. They saw where they were targeting. They knew when it was coming. So that doesn't mean it's without risk. There were troops on that airbase that was hit by Iran back in 2020 who suffered traumatic brain injuries, but there was no death. And so they're mitigating risk, the United States, behind the scene, whether it's military officials, and I'm sure our Pentagon folks are tracking closely, or if it's diplomats. And we also know on the Homeland Security front that Homeland Security officials in the United States are also trying to plan for what if. But there's a lot right now that will depend on what President Trump decides to do. Right. Does he let this go? Do his military advisors say to him, this is calibrated, it could have been worse? Or does he choose to slap back again? That's a question on that escalation ladder that analysts are going to be watching closely. But for our close allies in the region, Kuwait, Bahrain, Oman, they are very concerned that something may be coming to them and that the strike at Qatar that we're seeing may not be the end of it. The place that U.S. officials have been most concerned about vulnerability for America is in Iraq and those forces, that small force we still have in Syria. And I know Iraqi officials have been on alert. There was an ordered departure of Americans from our bases and diplomatic posts a few weeks back. So there has been some expectation that this is the kind of thing that could be happening.
Margaret Brennan, thank you. Margaret was saying that the U.S. has been preparing and ready for this, and Qatar reporting comes in, reporting, I believe, attributed to the authorities in Qatar saying that they have successfully intercepted missiles targeting a U.S. base. So the U.S. saw it coming and appears to have intercepted those missiles. Let's turn to Chief White House Correspondent Nancy Cordes. Nancy, the president was just at this base in Qatar about a month ago.
That's right, John. I was there covering him, and it's no surprise that he chose this particular base to visit, Al Udeid. It is the largest U.S. military base in the Middle East, home to 10,000 U.S. troops. They share that massive base with British troops and Qatari troops as well. It's about an hour or so outside Doha. It goes on for miles, and it has been a crucial outpost for the United States, both when it comes to counterterrorism and when it comes to past conflicts in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And it may be no surprise as well, John, that this attack took place right at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, just as White House officials were heading into a meeting with the President of the United States, with Pentagon officials as well, to discuss the situation with Iran. And now the question becomes, as Margaret pointed out, what, if anything, does the president do in response? This was a well signposted response by Iran. It didn't necessarily catch anyone by surprise. Is the president going to decide, you know what, they had to do this in order to save face domestically in Iran, and we're going to let it go? Or does the president seek to escalate? That's certainly something that Democrats on Capitol Hill have been very worried about, is how far does this go? Even though the White House says that it strikes over the weekend, on Iranian nuclear sites were self-contained. We're not meant to lead to further action. Once you see military strikes like this back and forth, what comes next is always unpredictable.
Indeed it is. Nancy Cordes, thank you. Let's bring back in Holly Williams, who's in Erbil, Iraq. Holly, I don't know if you heard Margaret Brennan was saying that one of the most vulnerable possible areas for an Iranian strike would be in Iraq. You mentioned earlier that Al-Assad Air Base is on the highest alert.
Right, so Margaret talked about the vulnerability of US forces here in Iraq and in neighboring Syria. We are just a few miles from a US base here in Erbil in northern Iraq, and I've spent time on some of those small US military outposts in Syria. I thought Margaret's reporting suggesting that this was a calibrated response is just fascinating, perhaps suggesting that this is almost, I guess, a face-saving operation, for want of a better word, on the part of the Iranians, that they need to not look weak in front of their regional rivals and their own people. But I would say this, back in 2020, Iran targeted the Al-Assad base here in Iraq with ballistic missiles. That followed the US killing a top Iranian military commander. We were on that base, on Al-Assad base, just a few days later, and we saw the extensive damage that had been done. Now, no American service members were killed, but some people would argue that that was good luck.
Mm-hmm. Holly, I want to just hold on to that. We're talking about calibrated response. There is a theatricality a little bit here, but just to underscore your point, which is that it may have been calibrated, but calibrated missiles explode just like ones that are sent with other intent.
There's always the risk of miscalculation and human error. I think the bigger picture here is we don't know how this is going to play out. If it indeed was a calibrated, as you say, almost a theatrical response, then do we also see diplomatic wheels turning? Do we see Iran capitulating, or at least agreeing to curtail its nuclear program? Or does this potentially spiral out of control into a bigger regional war?
Exactly. Holly Williams, thank you. Let's bring back in CBS News national security contributor Samantha Vinograd. Sam, tell us what steps have been taken here at home, and would this change anything in terms of readiness and preparations here if Iran somehow wanted to try to respond in the United States?
Sure, John. I will also note, just closing out the overseas element, that I do have sources indicating that the White House is anticipating additional strikes on U.S. bases overseas. And as I mentioned previously, the U.S. government has taken significant precautions to protect our members of the military to the greatest extent possible. Here in the U.S., security officials at the federal level have done outreach calls with their partners at the state and local level, with governors, with major law enforcement and religious associations, in anticipation of Iranian retaliation here at home. That could be individuals directed by Iran to launch attacks, part of their global proxy network. They've spent decades cultivating a surrogate network here in the United States, what we call sleeper cells in layman's terms, or individuals inspired by what's happened overseas to act, individuals we call homegrown violent extremists. Potential targets likely will be people in places associated with the U.S. military, people in places associated with the U.S. government, members of the Jewish community, and people in places associated with the state of Israel. Now, intelligence gathering is at a very high level at this time to look for threats, and law enforcement has already significantly stepped up its operational footprint, the number of law enforcement assets it has in and around potential targets. So Homeland Security officials are preparing for this, but still quite concerned about the threat environment. And finally, John, the risk of Iranian-backed cyber attacks is very concerning. They have sophisticated cyber capabilities and have used them before against critical infrastructure. Think energy and water grids, transportation infrastructure, and more. So cybersecurity officials, members of the private sector, members of the public should all remain vigilant, monitor for threats, and stay in close touch with federal, state, and local law enforcement.
Sam Vinograd, thank you so much. A little bit of reporting here in Bahrain says it has shut down the airspace temporarily. This is amid fears of retaliation by Iran against retaliation in response to the U.S. attacks. We're going to go now to Charlie D'Agata, who is at the Pentagon. Charlie, there's a report out of the United Arab Emirates that Iran says that the missile barrage on Qatar was the same number of bombs used by the U.S. on the nuclear sites. How do they read that over there? What's your what's your sense of what that might mean?
Well, certainly the Qataris aren't counting that number. You know, Margaret had reported 6. We're hearing as many as 10, but nowhere near the amount of munitions that were dropped on those nuclear sites in Iran. And it's part of Iran's messaging here. And again, we discussed it before. This is symbolic. Going after Al Udeid, the biggest, you know, the headquarters of CENTCOM in the Middle East. It's symbolic, saying we're going to get you where you are. Also, one of the best defended, knowing full well that if any base was going to be able to defend against a missile attack, a short-range missile attack like that, it would be capable of doing that. And as we've discussed before, all of these bases throughout the Middle East have already been, you know, on high alert and reinforced with beefed-up surveillance. This is ahead of the has closed down its airspace. Well, that is another huge base. That's the Fifth Fleet. The U.S. Fifth Fleet is based there. Kuwait has also rang the alarm in its areas. Again, these are all areas where there are U.S. bases. So not necessarily saying that they are next or that there's anything to indicate that they might be coming out under attack, but they're looking at what's happening at the audacity of attack at a place like Al Udeid and saying, well, we've got U.S. troops here. We've got U.S. troops in Bahrain with the Fifth Fleet. And then again, we really have to keep an eye on the more vulnerable troops, as Holly mentioned earlier, the ones who had already come under attack previously, places like Al-Assad, which is much more vulnerable to attack because they simply do not have the kind of air defenses that you might see at a place like Al Udeid and in Bahrain with the Fifth Fleet. Right. So I think we have to look at the nature of this attack, whether this is the beginning. The Qataris are saying that all of the missiles were intercepted without anybody getting injured. We're still waiting to hear from CENTCOM to see their reaction to it. But remember, CENTCOM is not just worried about Al Udeid. They're worried about every single base in that region. So they're going to have their hands full, and I understand why they're probably a little bit busy at the moment.
Charlie D'Agata, what we were seeing there before the map was the activation of the air defenses in Qatar. Let's go back to Margaret Brennan, who has some new reporting for us on the phone. Margaret?
Hi, John. We know that the other allies who have significant U.S. military presence on their shores, Kuwait, for example, which has the 4th largest U.S. military installation in the world, is bracing. There was an expectation that this firing at Qatar would happen, and that along with it there could be follow-on attacks. And so that is why some of the countries did start to look at closing their airspace earlier today. We know that there are further conversations being had as well amongst other U.S. intel agencies, Homeland Security officials, as well as the State Department and DoD CENTCOM about planning for this. So we do know that the Omanis, the Qataris, the Bahrainis, all of those countries that have been allies to both are bracing. What is interesting in terms of the firing at the U.S. base rather than at the city of Doha, for example, in Qatar, is that it's hitting at the United States directly. So far, these intercepted missiles did not appear to be aimed at domestic targets within Qatar. That would truly change the dynamic in the region. Qatar trades with Iran. Iran is not incredibly isolated in this region. It actually has started to rebuild some of its ties with some of these Arab states that they had tension with over years past. And so this is reintroducing some tension, though. But there's tension on the American side as well, with these allies saying, you know, we didn't have a warning well in advance that the United States was going to go ahead with this attack. The U.S. did notify 20 or 30 countries, a small number of them, though, when the planes were in the air. Those were who are in most direct risk. Saudi Arabia, for example, did have advance notice. Bahrain, some of the other regional allies did not.
And Margaret, very quickly, if the White House was expecting this, if this was the expected response, does that, going back to the idea of calibration, does that mean then that the next thing we should, how should that inform how we understand the next things we might hear from the Secretary of State or maybe even from the President himself, if this is something that was prepared for and if they receive it as a calibrated attack rather than a full-throated, all-out response?
Well, John, we know that in the planning for the attacks the U.S. carried out on Fordow, on Isfahan, and Natanz, it was not just the strikes that CENTCOM was planning for, it was also the blowback and preparing the theater. So there were protective measures put in place. So this had to have been gamed out with President Trump, right? He had to have been thinking about this as well. But that question is whether he goes up the escalation ladder or lets this go. And that is the difference between this being what was described yesterday in public by the Secretary of Defense as targeted and limited and specific to the nuclear program, or whether this becomes a more, a broader conflict. We know the President and the Secretary of State have indicated the U.S. has already identified other targets inside Iran it could hit. Didn't define that. Are those further nuclear sites, or are they now going to go up their escalation ladder? Right. So we know he's been looking at two options, and it's going to be what he chooses.
Margaret Brennan, thank you very much. I want to go back to Chief White House Correspondent Nancy Cordes, who has some new information. Nancy?
John, here's what we've heard from White House officials so far as they continue to watch what is unfolding in Qatar. We're told by a White House official that White House and DoD officials are aware of and closely monitoring threats to Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. Remember that top national security officials, Pentagon officials were already gathered at the White House for a scheduled meeting with the president. While there, they can take advantage of the Situation Room to monitor events as they unfold in Qatar. We have received more expansive reaction from the nation of Qatar itself, however. A short time ago, a spokesperson for the Qatari Foreign Ministry strongly condemning this attack by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, saying, quote, "We consider this a flagrant violation of the sovereignty of the state of Qatar." All of this putting the Gulf states and U.S. allies in the region in a very difficult position, John. On one hand, they don't want to get dragged into a wider conflict. On the other hand, they have had grave concerns about Iranian aggression and Iran's attempts to build a nuclear weapon for years, if not decades. And they shared those concerns with President Trump when he was in the region last month in Qatar, in the UAE, and in Saudi Arabia. As one top official in one of those Gulf states described it to me, they worry greatly about the possibility of a nuclear accident in Iran causing grave harm to their citizens. They said, look, if there was a nuclear accident in New York, you are going to feel the effects in New Jersey, and that's how they feel about it there. So a very difficult set of circumstances for Gulf states who the president views as very close allies right now in the wake of these attacks.
Nancy Cordes with reporting from the White House. Thank you very much, Nancy. I want to bring back in retired Air Force Lieutenant General Mark Wetherington. General, give me a sense of, there are planes in the air, U.S. planes in the air. Give us a sense of what you imagine is going on in terms of a response or a possible response. Margaret Brennan talked about that ladder of escalation. Do you have an idea of what that ladder could range from?
Well, I think, John, the first thought that comes to my mind is that 6 to 10 short-range ballistic missiles is not insignificant, but it's not the kind of coordinated multi-axis attack that's going to saturate our air defenses. I think it's whether it's symbolic or whether it's a reflection of the capacity that the Iranian military has after Israel's actions over the last week. We will learn that over time, but I think right now we'll sit and watch. We certainly have all the intelligence assets we can. We have all the force protection assets that we need if there were a different type of response from Iran, and I think we'll watch that situation develop.
What questions are going through your mind as somebody who's been in the jobs you have been, in terms of what would you want to know right now if you had access to the intelligence, or what do you think is the most important thing to think about over the next, say, 24 hours? Well,
there's a lot of questions. This could go a lot of ways, John. I think first and foremost, let's stick with the force protection problem, right? It's understanding that capacity that the Iranians have, understanding what they might be moving or positioning to take advantage of vulnerabilities that we have. I think we want to understand how well they can see and understand the battle space. And certainly our forces are taking actions, whether that's moving so that they're not always sitting stationary at an expected location and can be targeted, right? We're going to take those appropriate actions to ensure American men and women and our allies are safe.
And linger on that last point again. What kinds of things, I mean, at the base right now, what do you expect is happening in terms of personnel?
Certainly they're strengthening their defenses. They're alerting people to be ready for an attack. They've got their equipment and personal protective gear with them. They understand where they're going to be able to shelter and those types of things. Air defense units on the installations are at a higher level of readiness and alert to respond if there is another missile attack of any type. And I think those significant assets, very vulnerable assets that we might have, we're looking to make sure, can we move them somewhere else, either out of harm's way or keep them moving so that they can't be targeted in a more static way.
One other thing I want to ask you about is something you mentioned is it the case, or do you imagine it's the case, that U.S. intelligence is trying to figure out not just what Iran will do, but what it can do now that it's been significantly damaged by the Israeli attacks and now by the U.S. action? Absolutely.
And I think your second question is the more important one, right? We want to understand that capacity. We want to understand what is the range of options that they have. It's not about necessarily picking, this is exactly what we think they can do. It's about understanding what's that range of possibilities and preparing for that range.
Right. All right. Let's go back now to Holly Williams, who is in Erbil, Iraq. Holly, just staying on that question of what Iran actually can do, Iran has been significantly weakened over the last 2 weeks as a result of these attacks.
That's right, John. You know, Margaret was just talking then about the US expecting and planning for blowback. I think a lot of people here in the Middle East over the last day and a half have been sort of gaming out, asking themselves, what exactly is a weakened Iran capable of? What kind of retaliation can it carry out? Because make no mistake, Iran has been significantly weakened by more than 10 days of war with Israel. We have seen video after video coming from the Israeli military of strikes on missile launch sites, on Iranian drones. Now, it's really difficult to quantify, but I think we can assume that Iran's military is significantly less capable than it was 10 days ago. Not only that, also think about Iran's proxies here in the Middle East, the so-called axis of resistance. They have also been significantly weakened over the last 18 months or so. Hamas has been pummeled in Gaza. Hezbollah's leadership has been decimated by Israel in Lebanon. Here in Iraq, the Iran-backed militia groups responsible for the deaths of hundreds of US troops over the years have also been significantly weakened. And then the Houthis in Yemen have also been targeted with airstrikes. So we've been asking ourselves, what is a weakened Iran capable of? I guess today we have a little bit more clarity on that.
Important point, Holly, that it's not just the missiles they can fire, but also what they can activate or not activate in those proxy forces that they have throughout the Middle East. Holly Williams, thank you. Let's bring in senior national security correspondent Charlie D'Agata from the Pentagon. Charlie, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, again, first of all, just an update. We believe that whatever missile attack was pointed towards the Qataris and the Al Udeid is over. We're trying to get a count on how many, between 6 and 10. There are varying reports that there was an attack on the Al-Assad base in Iraq. The Iraqis themselves are denying that report that it happened. And I want to point out, so there are air raid sirens going on all across that Central Command region, places like Kuwait and places like Bahrain. Again, like Al Udeid, huge bases, well reinforced. In the case of Bahrain, you've got the Navy's 5th Fleet that's based there. It will be very heavily defended. But we have to talk about the more vulnerable areas, which is why everybody's paying attention to the Al-Assad base, which Holly pointed out earlier. Back in 2020, it came under a sustained attack. TBIs, a lot of traumatic brain injuries, but it was a serious attack, and one that Iran has and its proxies have attacked again and again because of its vulnerability. There are about 2,500 forces there. Closer where Hawley is another base there at Erbil in northern Iraq. Again, more vulnerable because it's smaller. It just doesn't have the kind of, Patriot weapon system, air defense systems, and the kind of systems that you'd see, aside from the fact that the Qataris themselves will have their own air defense systems in place. So when you're talking about the vulnerability of U.S. forces, the smaller the base, the forward operating base, the more vulnerable they are to attack because they don't have the kind of weaponry and machinery to take those incoming missiles down. We also want to point out there are about 700 to 900 special forces in Syria. And when we talk about the vulnerability of these forces because of their small footprint, they're also surrounded by bad neighbors. So they are within reach of Iran itself and Iranian missiles, but also within reach of any number, and I say that, any number of anti-American, possibly pro-Iranian regimes, either backed by Iran or just anti-American. And they are rife throughout parts of Iraq, especially around al-Assad, and also in Syria itself. So the big concern, certainly from CENTCOM, is if we see a sophisticated, coordinated attack on multiple bases, say you go after Al-Udeid, you go after Bahrain, you go after Kuwait, and then you go after these smaller bases like al-Assad, because the United States has beefed up its posture there. There's plenty of military options in the CENTCOM region, but if you overwhelm these bases all at once, and that's why all these alarms are going off all over the Middle East, that causes concern.
Right. That would be the full ladder of escalation. At the moment, it appears that we're on the lower rungs of that ladder, at least based on this preliminary reporting. A U.S. official confirms that the short and medium-range missiles that targeted Al-Udeid Air Base in Qatar have produced no casualties that have been reported at this time. Charlie Daggett at the Pentagon, thank you. I want to bring back in CBS News national security contributor Sam Vinograd. Sam, your thoughts?
My thoughts are that right now the intelligence community is working overtime really to try to assess two things. One is, of course, the state of Iran's nuclear program, but second is the intentions of the supreme leader of Iran. We're all, of course, very focused on whether the U.S. government and the Israeli government know where he is. But separate and apart from his location, what's going through his mind right now is likely what the intelligence community is focused on. They are trying to assess whether the supreme leader is intent on getting into a prolonged conflict with not just Israel, but with the United States, or if, having suffered maximum pressure from the United States, from Israel, and from international sanctions, these latest military strikes over the past couple of weeks will in fact push him back to the negotiating table. I know, John, that there's a war of words right now, a lot of inflammatory rhetoric being thrown around, but having worked on the early days of the Obama-era nuclear deal, it is possible that there are private channels that are open between the U.S. government and Iran and the supreme leader to try to find an off-ramp and to bring folks to the negotiating table. So again, the intelligence community's assessment of the supreme leader's intentions here, not just the nuclear program, not just his location, but the supreme leader's intentions should be a critical part of any national security decision-making process that exists in this White House and that tees up a decision for the President of the United States.
Sam, I think that that makes good sense, and you know, one of the things that we're trying to assess, because it will set the conditions for the U.S. response, is this idea of calibration. At the moment, there is no reporting that there are any strikes outside of the Al-Udeid base in Qatar. And that would, again, seem to be a calibrated, predictable response. The air defense systems appear to be working, and there have been no reports of casualties. So if this is a response that had to be taken, but that was very limited so as not to lead to more escalation, it would seem that it would be hard to imagine designing it you know, for anything other than to maybe de-escalate and return to the negotiating table. What do you think about my what is admittedly speculation there?
Well, I will focus instead on the fact that we really just don't know at this point whether this was an isolated incident. If it is, then this was certainly a calibrated response, and I agree with your analysis. We just don't know. It is too soon to tell. We are receiving some reports that White House officials do believe that additional attacks on U.S. bases are coming. What we don't know is if they'll attack well-defended bases or if they'll concurrently activate proxies and launch cyber attacks. What we do know is where they have activated folks in the past, again, military installations, government officials, Jewish religious sites, Israeli diplomatic facilities, and more. So while we try to speculate on whether this is calibrated, the key factors here are whether this was an isolated incident, and if it was not, whether adequate security precautions have been taken at potential target sites to prepare for security incidents. I do know that here in the homeland, there's been extensive planning, and as Margaret so aptly noted, prior to President Trump authorizing the military strikes over the weekend, there was significant planning about scenarios that could unfold if Iran chose to retaliate overseas. I think the biggest vulnerability here is for American citizens traveling overseas in locations where we just don't have a lot of assets, where proxies could be activated. That's one risk that will continue to follow, John.
Okay. Sam Vinograd, thank you very much. Let's go back to Senior National Security Correspondent Charlie D'Agata from the Pentagon. Just to reset for our viewers who are joining us, we have been reporting on Iranian missile attacks on the U.S. airbase or the U.S. base, I should say, in Qatar, the Al Udeid base in Qatar at the moment. That is the only place we have reports of action. No casualties reported, and apparently the missile defense systems have intercepted whatever missiles were sent there. Charlie, let's go to you. Your thoughts?
Well, first of all, we have a U.S. official confirms, this is in the CENTCOM region, confirms Iranian short and medium-range missiles targeted the Al Udeid air base. No casualties reported at this time. This is obviously after the Qataris themselves had said that they had come under attack. That happened about 50 minutes ago when we first heard word about it. Just to give you, again, a broad picture there, Al Udeid is the largest base. It's where Central Command is based. It's the headquarters there. There are 9,000 U.S. forces. In addition to that base, the biggest base in the Middle East for U.S. forces, Bahrain is the home of the Fifth Fleet. That has had sirens going off and shelter-in-place warnings for the residents there, although there haven't been any incoming. Kuwait is also on high alert, another big base there. There were reports that the Al-Assad base in Iraq had come under attack, but both the Iraqis and others have said those reports are erroneous. But everybody is on high alert throughout that whole Central Command area because of what they're seeing here, not necessarily because there is a threat that's headed in their direction.
Sure, only prudent. Charlie D'Agata at the Pentagon, thank you. Joining us by phone is Face the Nation moderator Margaret Brennan. Margaret, the latest you've been hearing, and also just as you've been evaluating this strike and what your reporting tells you about how we should think about the diplomatic conditions here and how they've changed, is there an opportunity here for the diplomacy to rush in? And if so, what is that opportunity?
Well, John, I've been trying to get hold of U.S. officials to better understand, the thinking in the White House right now. The message has been ready for diplomacy at any time. I was told by Secretary Rubio just yesterday that Steve Witkoff, the president's personal envoy, is on a 12-hour standby to get on a plane to meet with Iranian officials at any time should they say it's a go. We don't have any sign that it is a go at this moment in time. But what we are seeing play out is very much within the realm of anticipated risk, anticipated threat, and in fact, when this kind of intelligence is picked up, either through satellite, through signals intelligence, whatever the source of it is, the U.S. government prepares internally. Legally, they are also required to notify the public that there is risk. The first notice we got of this, we saw via the State Department telling people in Qatar to shelter in place if you're American. A few hours earlier, they issued a warning worldwide to Americans everywhere that there is an increased level of risk to Americans. That they are legally compelled to do when they are telling their own U.S. officials to prepare for something. And it doesn't necessarily mean it has to do with specific threat intelligence, but that because of what the United States did, enter this war that Israel has been waging against Iran and Iran hitting it back, the United States is now a player, not just because we are the biggest provider of arms and weaponry and defenses to Israel, but because now it is our planes that have gone in there and done such a high-profile attack against the crown jewels of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard and the clerics that run that country, who have invested hundreds of billions of dollars in this program that they claimed was not a weapon, despite credible evidence suggesting otherwise, that they went beyond the civilian intention of it that they said it was for. They have now been decimated, and that the airspace over Iran, they don't own. They are in a place where anyone gaming this out said Iran has to do something, they can't do nothing. Now, does this get it out of the way and clear the deck for the diplomatic opportunity you're talking about? We have to wait and see, but certainly we don't know what that means at this point. Secretary Rubio just yesterday kept emphasizing again and again they want to talk this out and come to a settlement with Iran, but at the same time talked about how horrifically, how horrific the regime running the country is. So offering a lifeline for that regime to stay in power, it seems also to be a point of debate within the administration, because hours after we were told by the Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State that the U.S. was not seeking regime change, the president put out a social media post joking about it.
Right. Margaret Brennan, that point about the worldwide threat that has gone out now, even though it's automatic, it does give us a sense of the landscape of the national security concern in the wake of this attack. I want to get back to that question of regime change in a second, but General, let me ask you here. Margaret was mentioning the initial attack. Describe for our viewers the precision of the U.S. attack, just the nature of it, and how we should understand that in terms of the range of U.S. military action that could have been taken.
You bet, John. I think it's important for the viewers to understand that there's no other weapon system combination like a B-2 and the MOP. Just in terms of how those two are paired, the extreme navigation accuracy of the B-2 coupled with the precision on the weapon. It's a big weapon. It's not affected by environmental conditions like others are. And it's just so highly tuned to be precise, as we saw multiple weapons going into the same hole in the ground. And so I think a very technologically advanced attack, and one that only the U.S. could carry out. And
in your assessment, in terms of the precision, based on what we know, carried off as designed? From everything that I've seen, absolutely within the design, very precise. And to the extent, and we don't know that this is the case, but to the extent that it was precise, in other words, going after just the nuclear sites and not a lot of collateral action, how would you help us understand that? Because it would seem to be that the Iranian response might be inspired by this. In other words, if it was an indiscriminate U.S. response, that calls for a certain kind of response. If it's a targeted military response, that might call for another kind. You're only going to call the B-2 and the MOP for a very specific target complex. Fordo was that complex. Very deep, very hard to target, had to be very precise. And so that's why it was used. I'm not sure I can compare it directly to the Iranian response. I think that's more of what's their capacity right now to respond, and whether that's a signal that they're sending in terms of what they'd like to see going forward, and if they want to continue to advance negotiations or something like that, I'm not sure. Thank you, General. Let's go back to Holly Williams, who's in Erbil, Iraq. Holly, Margaret mentioned the question of regime change. Obviously, hangover from the Iraq War, in which that was the stated goal. The president's officials on Face the Nation and elsewhere were saying we're not interested in regime change. Then the president suggests, well, maybe regime change wouldn't be so bad. How do you read all this, and how's it being read in the region?
Right. So, John, I'm sure you saw that social media post from President Trump yesterday where he seemed to suggest that regime change in Iran was a possibility. We don't know how serious he was. And the White House sort of later said that, he was just raising it as a question. As you pointed out, engineered regime change here in Iraq and also in Afghanistan dragged the U.S., at least arguably, into a quagmire and cost the United States copious amounts of blood and treasure. Here in Iraq, we've been talking talking actually to Iranian opposition groups. Several of them are operating here. They're outlawed by the Iranian regime. They're living in exile across the border here in Iraq. The Iranian regime, as you know, is deeply unpopular with many Iranians. Just cast your mind back to the Woman Life Freedom protests of 2022. Now, what those Iranian opposition groups had to say to us was extremely interesting. They said, you know, look, nobody wants war, but on the other hand, strikes serve the purpose of weakening the Iranian regime, which is what they want. But they were very clear. They said that they did not want engineered regime change in Iran. They said they wanted to rebuild their country themselves into a truly democratic, free, secular, and non-nuclear Iran.
Holly Williams for us from Erbil, Iraq. Thank you, Holly. Senior White House correspondent Weijia Jiang joins us now with new reporting. Weijia?
Well, John, we just heard from a defense official who tells CBS News that the Al Udeid air base was attacked by short-range and medium-range ballistic missiles originating from Iran today, adding that at this time there are no reports of U.S. casualties. Of course, they are closely monitoring the situation, as is President Trump, who was already scheduled to have a meeting with members of his national security team here at the White House just as these strikes unfolded, John.
All right, Weijia Jiang at the White House for us. Thank you. To recap, Iran has just launched a retaliatory strike on the U.S. airbase Al Udeid in Qatar. No casualties are reported at this time, but officials are anticipating additional attacks on more U.S. bases in the short term. The Iranian attack was in response to the targeted strikes President Trump ordered over the weekend, which struck 3 key Iranian nuclear sites. Our coverage will continue on CBS News 24/7, your local news, and tonight on the CBS Evening News. This in New York.
The man. You will pay the price.
These people are really trying me. Zach, draft a reminder for my fellow representatives that I've already made it clear that I'm not voting unless the funds for affordable housing have been explicitly earmarked. Please make sure that's understood. Thanks. Hello? Someone in here?
Well, ain't you the vision of health today, Congressman?
You.
All these fancy workout toys for you rich folk to play with. Reckon a good old boy like me could only dream of belonging to a place like this. Unless, of course, someone like you were to help me out with that.
Relax.
Why are we wasting time sitting around? The lab better have come through with those DNA results.
Well, hello to you too, Kat.
Don't give me that face. Jacob, please tell me we have what we need to take that psychotic bitch down. Are you lost?
Actually, I'm right where I need to be. Now, just which bitch were we talking about?
These model release forms need to be comprehensive. Full protection for the talent, limited usage for the client. Great, handle it and get back to me. Just because I'm a pretty face doesn't mean I don't know my business.
That's because I taught you well.
No, you are not here.
Well, I can be. To help you with the contracts for your new modeling agency.
I don't need help. You just saw that I'm...
Miss me?
No.